All right, Mr. Chairman, we're ready whenever you are.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the Community Development Committee to order. The time is now 3:03, and as customary. First, we don't have any public participation. Do we have any?
We have one person signed up to speak.
Okay, we'll give that person a minute and a half.
All right, sounds good. Mr. Bryant, if you are on the call, you just press *6, and you have 1 minute and 30 seconds. Mr. Bryant, I don't think he's with us, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
And then we just had the two public comments that I sent to the committee beforehand.
okay. If everyone get an opportunity, you can read the comment that Mr. Bryant has submitted. And I think everyone have a copy of those things. So we'll go down to the approval of the minutes for November 21st, 24. Have a
Move for
motion.
approval.
Second.
It was moving second. All in favor by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Ayes have it. Opposes? None. We don't have any old business, so we go right on down to the new business. New business is an update on the housing goals for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I think this is a presentation just to give us an update. I don't think there's no action we have to be taking on this right now. I think, and what I would like to do and ask that even after the presentation, that all council members get a copy of this so they can kind of review it. So when it comes back, if it comes back to the whole body, they'll be able to be familiarized with what we're talking about, so we can make a proper and judge decision on what we're going to do. Thank you. So we can go on with the presentation.
We've got Naaman here in the chambers, so turn it over to you. And I think we've had an opportunity to take a sneak peek at it, and I think it's a culmination of a lot of different efforts. And so excited for him to run through all they've been able to figure out.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Excited to be back down here with you all. Just want to make sure that you guys are seeing all the updates that we've been making with the Housing Community Development Department, with Gianna, and with the mayor. Kind of the purpose of this is really to refresh you guys and refresh your memory on what we presented back in September, give you a few updates, primarily on supporting data and analyses, and ahead of kind of discussions that we anticipate to come next year that will probably get into like what are the actual needs and strategies that the city could take to really start to reach these goals, right? And so we aren't at that point in the conversation yet, but hoping to be able to support the city as they get there early to mid Q1. And again, Bloomberg Associates, we're just supporting this effort on the city and really helping to facilitate discussions and data analysis for the city to come up with its long-term housing goals. With that being said, I'll go ahead and jump into the presentation. And before I do, I will say, I would like for you guys, if you don't mind, to hold any questions or comments you have until the end of the presentation, unless they are technical questions about what is actually on the slides in front of you. So again, today, a couple of things we want to do. We want to do a scope of work refresher, talk about the updated gap analysis. That gap analysis looks at the gap between the supply of housing and the demand for housing at various income levels. We're going to talk about the housing goals with the status of the work we're doing around those goals and any updates there are. And then also interim outputs on a number of different analyses and studies that we're doing to support the development of these goals. So one of those is a development feasibility study. The second is a home ownership accessibility study. And the last thing looks at various funding sources that may be available. It includes a study of alternative revenue sources. We'll close it up with some next steps So we shouldn't take any more than about 30 minutes to get through this, and then we can talk through any questions or discussion afterwards. Should be pretty quick, although it's a decent amount of slides. Any questions before I hop into it?
No.
All right. So just to remind you guys on what the scope of work looks like, we've gone through a number of phases since May with the city. We helped them to kind of pull together and connect various disparate sets of data. I think this was a very, helpful process for the city, bringing all those data sets together. I think it's very important to be able to analyze and understand kind of what the city's doing in terms of output and outcomes. And so that was the first part. The second phase has been drafting, goals. So looking at what the city has done historically, what the city has the capacity to do going forward, and coming up with initial goals. And so we presented those to you all in September and have been working to calibrate them since then based on the resources that are available and a better understanding of what the actual cost of addressing the problem or the issues are. At this point, we're at the kind of goal finalization phase, and the city is really firming up all the goals. I think what we're presenting to you today is 99% of, close to the finalization of those goals. There are a few, there's like one small gap, but I think we're coming to an end of what we think this process should be. So I'll start with a presentation on the gap analysis. So I want to kind of start with this map. This came from a New York Times article, and what it shows is really the effects of what's happened in Charleston over the past decade and a half, right? And we talked about this map, I think, in our last presentation, but you all know that your median income has grown significantly over the past decade, especially between 2010 and 2020. You've seen it grow even since then, both your average household size getting smaller. But what I think is really important in understanding about this growth is that the net growth in the city of Charleston has actually gone down. So you've had a net increase in moves out in the city of Charleston and a net increase in moves in outside of the city of Charleston. We'll get into why that is, but I think first of all, I'll say that is primarily because it has gotten more and more expensive to live in the peninsula and within the city of Charleston. So we looked at the various gap analysis that have been done in the city and in the county over the past 5 to 6 years. We were able to look at and compare the outcomes from those and what the analyses kind of studied. And I want to walk you through the findings from those various analyses and how they compare, right? So first, the city of Charleston had a consultant do a housing gap analysis in 2021. That analysis looked at really the difference or the difference between the number of homes available at various income levels or affordable at various income levels and the number of households that were at those income levels within the city of Charleston. And so what it found was that the largest gap between, or the deficit, which are highlighted in blue, are at the lowest AMI or the lowest income levels, below 30%, between 65 and 80%, and then above 120% AMI. That analysis also looked at what was likely to happen or a projection for what was to come by 2030. What it found is that it expected the gap or the deficit to grow in every income group except for the 80 to 100% of AMI and the 100 to 120% of AMI. Whereas even if from 80 to 100% of AMI, the gap would grow, but it would stay in the black, meaning that there would not be a gap, there'd be a surplus, or it'd be even. And then you have Charleston County. Of course, this is a different geographic subset, right? So we're looking at beyond the city of Charleston's boundaries, so you can't directly compare the two. But what the county found is very similar to what was the case in the city. The largest gap or the largest need for affordable housing was at that lowest income level. And again, there was also additional need for housing at the highest income level. I want to reiterate, though, that this is just on the renter side. This does not account for sale and for homeowners. These are the gap in what's available for renters. And then lastly, we started to do our own analysis, which had a different methodology from the one that the city did or the city's consultant did in 2021. This used a nationally kind of a national best practice in terms of how to determine the affordability gap. But we found similar results, right? The largest gap was at the bottom of the income bracket, right? You looked at below 50%, below 30% of AMI is where you see significant gaps or deficits in needs for affordable housing. And again, a deficit at the higher income level. And so this section here actually represents a geography that extends beyond the city of Charleston. We use a census district that accounts for parts of Charleston, Charleston County, and Berkeley County. So it's a little bit beyond just the city limits. What we had to do is we had to make estimates using our methodology to estimate what the gap was actually in the city of Charleston. And what we found is that when we compared this to what was in 2021, that gap had actually gone down a little bit, right? Especially at the lowest AMI level. The need for affordable housing went down a little bit. And you may ask why, right? Why would the need for affordable housing go down at those AMIs if prices are going up? I want to pull us back to the map that I showed first, right? Where you had people moving out. So what that means is that as people are moving out, the demand is being reduced. And so that gap is only going down because lower income people are being pushed out of the city, out of the peninsula, and to the outer portions of the region. So that gap going down isn't necessarily a good thing in this case, but it is what happens from a statistical standpoint. So another visualization is what we call a Skansky graph. This graph estimates or shows what the supply and demand look like when you put them together. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the stratification of the various income groups from the 30% of AMI income group all the way up to above 120% of AMI. On the right side, you'll see the aligning housing, right? So housing that's affordable to the various income groups. And you'll see lines that are color-coded going between the two. What this shows is that a large number of those purple at the top, those purple, I don't know if they can see this. No. How do I get this off? Okay, there we go. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the purple at the top, you see that a lot of those renters are paying a lot more because they're going all the way to the yellow square at the bottom, right? That means those people earning less than 30% of AMI are paying the equivalent of rent of what somebody at 120% of AMI can actually afford, and vice versa. There are a lot of people at higher income levels that are, what I'd like to say, cannibalizing some of the housing that is affordable at lower income levels. So you see those yellow squiggly lines going down to the 30% of AMI and the 50% of AMI and the 80% of AMI. What this means is that there are a lot of renters out there who are probably already in very affordable units where their incomes have gone up, or there are people that have recently moved here that are now competing with lower income people for affordable housing that isn't income restricted. And so what that means is it puts additional pressure on those lower income people, and they're either forced to move out or they're forced to pay rents that are more than what they can afford, right? Any questions on this diagram? I know it's a lot, but I think it's helpful to understand how the market is likely working.
It's actually a really cool illustration because it shows the dynamic nature of people's decision making based on income. It's not just static, 30% buy 30%, 120% buy 120%. It's more fluid than that. So it's pretty good.
The other comment I would make is that when I first saw this, which I agree with you, Councilmember McBride, it's a pretty powerful graphic that, how is somebody that's making 30% AMI, getting down into these much higher income units. And the correlating data shows that that's why default rates are so high or going
Eviction,
up.
yeah.
Eviction rates are going up. So the answer is they can't. And so again, it just points to some problems that in a pretty clear and concise way, I think.
So I think, as I said in September, our purpose here is to support the city in gathering a lot of acute, data sets and points to help them set these goals in a more strategic fashion. I think, these are things that I think all of you know anecdotally already, but having this data and knowing exactly what segments of the market, what geographic areas are in most need can really help you all set your goals in a strategic way and really address the issue in a fashion that is very efficient and impactful. So with that, I'm going to push us to the actual goals themselves. And so you guys have seen these goals already. I'll run through them really quickly, but is only one change or update to them. I think the top line goal, of course, is to create 3,500 more affordable or attainable homes. And that can be done either through new development or through conversion. The second is to build at least 7,500 new homes. And the third was, before, it was to increase the number of homes sold annually at or below $300,000. So we've since completed our kind of homeownership accessibility study, and we found that there really isn't much product transacting below $300,000, whether new build or existing. And that, if we're trying to serve or trying to increase the market's ability to address the demand at that 100% of AMI level or median income level, it's probably closer to $400,000. And that's more realistic given the market conditions. So we've updated that. The fourth goal is to catalyze $800 million of investment in affordable housing. And we're going to need that in order to achieve the rest of the goals. The fifth is to reduce persons experiencing homelessness by 25%. And the sixth is to stabilize at least 1,000 existing households. All right. So these are the 6 draft goals that we have. I think we're pretty much firmed up on these, except for the final one. We're waiting on some eviction data from the state to come through. But once that does, and we finalize the goal around stabilizing households, I think the city feels that these are the goals and the targets that they want to move forward with. I'll pause here for any questions or clarification. I'm not going to go through the full slides on the goals, but I do want to just pause in this summary.
If I may, one point that I think some people and some of your constituents may panic when you see goal number 2, but the reality of it is this is every bit a supply issue as it is an affordability issue. And so when we look at the city's system, and we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later on, we can easily accomplish number 2. It's just how many units are caught in our own process is really telling. So when you see that chart and that map, which I think is another very powerful graphic of how many people are moving out of the area where we frankly are trying to focus public transportation and infrastructure dollars and, a whole host of other things, it's pretty clear to me that we need to do something. So.
That's right. And I think to speak to that, sorry.
Mr. Chairman, Councilmember McBride has his hands up.
Sorry, thanks. Yeah, just kind of keying on a little bit what the mayor had just alluded to, like I know that we have, not for necessarily all workforce housing price point level, but just overall housing that's needed to be built. You know, I think the mayor's alluding to that we already have a whole bunch in the pipeline that's going through the process. You know, like Long Savannah has a whole bunch, several on, lots in Johns Island, other places. So if we know that there's housing in the permitting pipeline that's going to be built just because of supply demand and just from the free market, is that taken into consideration? Like, if we can predict 6 months from now, 1 year from now, about this many homes of this price point will be built because of past history. See what I'm saying? Like,
The
does that?
the problem is it's not being built, and the prices are going up. And you're having more and more wealthier people move here, which is why our area median income has more than doubled in the past decade plus. And so what that's doing is it's pushing people that do live here out. And especially right now with the macro economy, and you'll see some more information on this later. Some of those things that are caught in permitting, just the original underwriting on it doesn't work anymore, and they in all likely may not be built, at least for the foreseeable future. So it's a pretty complex problem,
Yeah.
but just because we have things in our pipeline, even if we cleared it completely, which we do need to do a lot better work on our end, on expediting things, but it's still not going to address the issue. So
I do want to be clear on that, and I'll elaborate quickly on that. Like, if you look historically, on average, the city has not produced that many units on an annual basis. Currently, there's about 17,000 units as of June of this year that are in the pipeline, and by in the pipeline, we mean either in permitting or in some type of development or planning review process. That's a lot of units. You could meet the goal with just those 17,000. But if the city's not producing any more than 1,500 units on average on an annual basis, you're not likely to get those 17,000 units by 2030, right? And I'm going to be really honest with you guys, based on the number of people moving into Charleston or into the region, even those 17,000 units doesn't accommodate the demand, right? And so as the city continues to have people flow into the metropolitan area and bidding up housing and the demand for housing, if you do not increase the production, you're going to see housing prices continue to inflate, right? Especially when the people that are coming have higher incomes and more disposable income than the people that are already living here.
One follow-up question really quick, if you don't mind.
All right, Councilman.
This is not an easy question to answer. I know it's a hard question just because of the nature of things, but because demand changes constantly, I know we've seen, in recent years, a very high increase or spike in demand. No one can ever predict that's going to remain that way. And so I'm not saying we got to do something, and this is a good attempt. We got to figure out what to do to address the current need, but knowing the economy, national, local housing demand, changes every few years, it waxes and wanes. So it's like, if we implement this plan and then the economy changes drastically in a way we didn't expect, nationally, internationally, housing demand changes 5 years unpredictably, which is reality. That's life all the time. I've just thrown that out there as an impossible question to answer, but just to kind of just put it out there as a discussion point. Like, what I mean? We're trying to solve a problem that's happening now, and we can't predict what it's gonna be like in 5 years.
So I'm going to say this
Yeah.
really quickly before I move on. So this country as a whole has underproduced in terms of housing for the past 2 decades. So we're behind by hundreds of thousands of units across the country, right? Cities are far more behind than other areas just because of the nature of them and that they are growing and people are moving from more rural areas to cities. Household sizes are declining, and so you're seeing, less density within the housing units themselves, which is contributing to it. And then you're having more household formation, right? And so household formation stalled during periods of the economy where the economy wasn't great in 2007, 2008, and years directly afterwards. And what you saw during the pandemic was, pent up kind of household formation that finally came to fruition during the pandemic. I think even if, let's say, in-migration into the country, international in-migration into the country were to slow down, I think you would still need to address the pent-up demand that the country as a whole did not address for the past 20 years, right? And I think, yes, there is a chance that perhaps, overall in-migration into the country slows down, but that really won't have an impact on the need in Charleston for the next 10 years.
Yeah, it's a good answer. Thanks.
Well, no, at the national leagues of cities, they can't put that same question. Someone can't put that same question there. And the answer that we're receiving now is a little different from what they're saying up there. So what we're going to have to do is grasp most of these information here and then kind of put it together and hash it out, because you're hearing two different stories from different entities, from what we heard at the National League of Cities. Even with the migration of people moving in and moving out, that happened every 10 years, 20 years. It's a change. And I don't think we're going to ever go back down to the point that we're going to have, really, to me, housing that people are going to be able to afford here, because even our city staff can't afford any housing in this peninsula here, from Charleston, Johns Island, West Ashley, even going to North Charleston now is totally different, and even almost county-wide. So this is why you see the different demographic of the people have changed. When you had a very diverse community, you don't have that anymore. And it's going. I don't see how it's going to come back, because we are not even making the salaries or the money here to be able to afford these particular housing that's even coming forth. Even when we try to do what we call workforce housing, affordable housing, if you may, because they say the dirt is so expensive right now. You see, so it's going to probably change. I don't know where it's going to change that way, because things happen, that we don't have no control over. But it's being out here all these years, I can see the difference in the changes and see the difference in the feasibility studies and all these things that we are having. Even what community development office have done, we have to look at even what we have even turned to HUD so far as every year we do the consolidated plan. So even with that, what we have sent to them, and looking back at what we're trying to do now, we have to look at all these things holistically and see how we can do all these things that we're talking about.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Councilman Mitchell. I'm going to push us forward unless there are any technical questions.
No, go ahead. Move on.
Councilmember Parker has her hands up.
Is it a
Councilman Parker, I didn't see it. I'm sorry.
Is it a technical question or is it a comment?
Technical, a little pertaining to this 7,500. I was just curious. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious if Bloomberg had any data or comments regarding, what the demand will be on infrastructure. I mean, 7,500 additional units citywide. I mean, have there been discussions or data points or anything like that regarding the demand on our roadways?
We haven't done any traffic studies to look at what that will do to some of the infrastructure, whether it's water infrastructure or traffic. That hasn't been part of this.
You want to kiss the her? Okay.
You can go on now.
All right. So as part of the development feasibility study, what we were looking to do is really understand how is the market currently working in Charleston, both from a rental perspective and from a for sale perspective. I want to highlight that what we're showing you are illustrative examples of developments that could or have happened in Charleston, right? These do not represent any particular development, whether past or future, but they're illustrative examples that we were able to pull together from feedback from the development community, from practitioners, about what the baseline assumptions and inputs are within developments, and what the necessary threshold for investment from larger financial institutions and investors for these types of projects. What we're showing you now is just the rental side. We're in the midst of doing the for sale side at the moment, but this is kind of an interim output just for the rental. I'm going to ask again to hold your comments until the end. If you have technical questions about what's on screen, happy to answer those because those can happen pretty quickly. So this was a three-phase kind of study. The first phase is really understanding the current state and economics of the market rate rental and for sale developments. The second phase is looking to understand the options and cost of developing additional affordable housing as part of those market rate developments. So similar to your density bonus programs where there's a requirement to provide affordable housing, understanding what's the trade-off or what's the cost to the developer in providing those units. The third is to develop specific policies to increase housing development and encourage affordable housing. So where we are now is meeting with those practitioners, with those developers, taking the information that we've gotten from this study and looking at various incentives that could possibly be put into the city's toolkit, whether they be tax abatements, whether they be gap financing, whether it be additional density bonuses, or streamlining the development review process, and what impact they could have on development and the ability to include affordable units within those developments. So how do we take this on? What we looked at was a combination of development typologies. And so what you see here are these typologies. So you've got everything from a high-rise building all the way down to a single family. And again, these single families are not for sale. It was BTR, or built to rent. And in between there, you have everything from mid-rise with structured parking, mid-rise without structured parking, garden-style apartments, and then townhomes, right? These are all the various kind of types of general types of development that you see in Charleston and around the region. You combine that with a land tier. So what we did is we looked at transactions for land and around the city of Charleston, and we divided it up into kind of 4 tiers or submarkets. And we looked at those transactions and we're able to ascertain that based on the size of the transaction, meaning the lot size within that tier, there were even variations in the price per acre there. So what you do is you combine each of those typologies with a land tier and you get a scenario. So typology plus tier equals a specific development scenario. And I can come back to this map so you guys can see where those tiers are, but tier 1 is generally in the lower peninsula, and tier 2 is somewhat, upper peninsula, West Ashley. Tier 3, as you'll see, those dark blue dots are within nodes and the outer reaches of the city. And then those light blue or tier 4 tiers or tier 4 transactions tend to be more removed from arterial roads and less valuable land out in the suburbs and exurbs of the city. So when you combine those, what we did is we ran the numbers, right? We used a very simplified kind of profitability kind of measurement. So yield to cost or yield on cost. Yield to cost is basically the net operating income, right, for development over the total development cost, right? And so generally, this is kind of a hurdle rate or a threshold that's used early on in development projects to understand whether or not they're feasible and it's worth moving forward, trying to find investors to kind of invest in those projects. And investors aren't going to invest in anything if it doesn't generally meet that initial hurdle rate. For our purposes, we use the hurdle rate or a minimum threshold of 6% yield to cost. And so what we found is that the development scenarios that were most feasible were the high-rise and mid-rise podium in tier 1, the garden-style apartment in tier 4, and the single-family BTR in tier 4. Of course, that doesn't mean those are the only ones that are feasible, right? Everything you see in yellow is what we call potentially feasible. They didn't quite reach the threshold of 6%, but any change in an assumption, if they were able to buy land at a cheaper price, if they had a larger project that was able to spread the cost over more units, if they were able to garner higher rents, that could push it over the 6% threshold. And as you'll see, a lot of the mid-rise was really close to that 6% threshold. But
Can you
this
go
comes
back
down-
one? Oh, I'm
Say
sorry.
what?
Can you,
Go ahead.
when you're done to this slide, can you go back to the previous slide just for a second?
Yep, I
when
can
you're
go back
done.
right now.
All right, cool. Thank you. Just want to get the tiers straight. Okay, got it. Thank you.
And so you'll hear us talk about kind of the time that it takes to get a development through the planning process and through the review process. You know, that time equals money. And so for projects that are in that yellow category, that can mean making a project, like the mayor said, you know, feasible or infeasible, right? So if you're teetering on that threshold and, you know, the project was originally supposed to take 18 months, but it takes 4 years, you know, that, you know, time is a time value of money. And ultimately, that project could be infeasible by the time it's time to put shovels in the ground. So what happens, we want to look at what happens when we try to add the burden of 80% of AMI affordable units onto these projects, right? So if we were to reduce the rents for 20% of the units at a level of 80% of AMI, all of a sudden, none of these projects are in that green or mostly feasible category. And a lot more of the projects are now in that least feasible category. And so what that tells us is that even without affordable units, there aren't a lot of types of development that are feasible in the city of Charleston right now. And I think that that's true. You're not seeing a lot of development happen in the city for that reason. And so when you try to layer on top of that additional affordability, you really have to have some additional incentives or subsidies to make the numbers work. So the next step of this was trying to determine what is that gap, right? What's that additional cost? How much would it take per affordable unit to get that yield to cost back to 6.5%, right? What would it take? So we found out, we did the calculation for all of the different scenarios, and you'll see there are a lot of numbers that are grayed out, partially because, or fully because they're over $500,000. Anything over $500,000, I think, is not reasonable to look at, because if you're having to subsidize a project more than $500,000 per unit, that's really not efficient, right? What we found is that in a lot of these, the mid-rise and the garden style and the townhouse and missing middle, it was between $150,000 and $400,000 per unit to subsidize those units or get back to a yield on cost that would allow investors to invest in those types of projects. That is in line with the back of the envelope numbers we used to come up with the $800 million kind of goal in terms of catalyzing the funding necessary to meet the goals of the city. Right? We used the back of the envelope number of around $250,000 a unit. And so this is just for new development. Of course, conversion is a lot cheaper, but these numbers make sense. And we talked to a number of developers of both affordable and market rate housing about the assumptions and the outputs here. And this was in line with what they were thinking. So what happens if you want those units to be at 50% and not at 80% of AMI? Because 50% of AMI is actually where we need the units. So that number jumps up from 150,000 in some places now to 340,000, right? And the cheapest option. It's extremely costly to add affordability to projects. I think these are things that you all know already from getting projects in the ground and working with Gianna. The amount of subsidy, federal subsidy and local subsidy that has to go into these projects is immense. So we wanted to work the opposite direction, right? What we wanted to do next was think about the scenarios where the city actually owns the land. And so the city often is disposing of or giving away land or as part of a development project to try and get affordable units in return. And so we wanted to look at what is that worth sometimes, right? And so for each of these different types of projects, we worked backward and we said, all right, if the city is covering the land and we can remove the cost of the land from the development, how many affordable units at various AMIs can we get? So in this model at 80% of AMI, in the mid-rise podium, mid-rise no podium in tier 1, or in the missing middle townhome in tier 2, you can get almost 50% of the units, right? But in most of the other scenarios, you're not getting more than 20%. And you're going to get the most bang for your buck where the land is the most expensive. That makes sense because if the city is providing the land at a discount or for free, the subsidy that the city is providing is technically greater. And the revenues that the developer can charge for the market rate units is also greater. So what if you wanted to get 50% of AMI units? The number of units that can be included in these projects goes down significantly. So what we're doing next, right, as a part of this study is looking at other types of incentives in addition to providing land, right? As I said before, looking at tax abatements, density bonuses, and gap financing subsidies, streamlining the development process and what the impact is so that the city can develop its own tool of incentives and subsidies to provide developments so that they can include affordable housing. This is because we know that the federal government is not going to step up and provide additional funding for affordable housing in the near future, and the city is going to have to figure out ways to get more affordable housing on its own. All right, I'm going to move on to the homeownership accessibility study. This is where we looked at kind of what kind of for sale product was available throughout the city and what that meant in terms of affordability and what the average person or various income groups could afford. So we looked at all the transactions back to 2019 in the city, and we used some assumptions around down payment and around what someone was willing to pay in terms of their mortgage and interest rates, and we brought it all into 2024 dollars to take out kind of inflation, right? And so what we found is that all of the transactions, this is both transactions of existing and new, almost 30% were at $800,000 or more. We broke that up and looked at the city in the peninsula versus the city off the peninsula, and then outside of the city and the rest of the county, right? Most of those transactions were either off the peninsula or in the county, and I think that's what you would expect. But both in the city and the peninsula, you saw 52% of the transactions above $800,000. And also outside of the city and the county, 30% of the transactions were above $800,000. And so I'm going to show this to you in a few different ways now. We look at the pre-pandemic kind of steady state, what was happening on a regular basis before 2020. We look at the midst of the pandemic and how sales spiked in that period, and then post-pandemic. What you're seeing in the bars are the actual sales volumes on the peninsula, the city of Charleston, and outside the peninsula, and then outside of the city of Charleston and the rest of the county. The county has historically and continues to be the bulk of where transactions happen. And what you're going to see is that orange line represents the annual number of new build transactions, meaning homes that were built that are new build that are being sold to the first home buyer. That number has dropped precipitously during the post-pandemic slowdown, partly due to higher interest rates. So when you think about that happening, right, and the total new build transactions just dropping, right? So the city of Charleston grew about 9% in terms of population over the same period, while the number of new build housing units fell from just under 160,000 down to 12 this year. And during that period, you saw increases in every typology of housing. So single-family residences grew 37%, where the median went from 440,000 to 600,000, and townhomes went from 324,000 to 409,000, and then condos went from 244,000 to 377,000.
Can you define new build transaction, what that means?
A new build transaction means that it was built within a year of the transaction happening. So these are new builds, meaning that this is the first person to move into that house.
12? This seems ridiculously small.
It is in line with if we look at some of the data on what's in the permitting and construction pipeline, there were just about that many in the pipeline earlier this year.
And a transaction could mean a neighborhood or
No, these are all individual units.
individual units. Okay, it's really small. All right, thanks.
So I think one of the big takeaways from this is that what was affordable or of the market, in the market, you had a large portion of the units available that were affordable to the average person, right? So we've segmented this into 3 different segments: below 400,000, 400, 800,000, and then 800,000. Given interest rates and everything else, the most resilient part of the market is going to be those who have really high incomes. They're not really affected by the high interest rates, and they're not affected by the increases in construction cost and just the increased cost of land. But what is affected is that home price, or the homes that are selling at $400,000 or lower. So almost half of the market was $400,000 or lower before the pandemic. Now that's almost down to a quarter. That's in the entire county. Looking at Charleston County in just new build, it used to be 30% of the market was below $400,000, and the rest of it was in the middle of the market. Now, what's happened is the middle of the market has stayed. You've halved that $400,000 or below segment of the market, and you've doubled the $800,000 or more market. And then when you look in the city of Charleston, right, and their transactions, it also looks just like what the previous slide looks like, right? Primarily, you're seeing transactions off the peninsula. The new build transactions have completely stopped, and they follow the same pattern from pre-pandemic to the pandemic to post-pandemic. And then you'll see this is the city only, where almost half of the transactions were below 400,000 before, and now you're down to a quarter. And so this is really important because we think about the for sale market and the rental market being these 2 separate things, but really they're intertwined. The more unaffordable the for sale market becomes, the more pressure and demand there is on the rental market, and that pushes down on a lot of the lower income people. And so as you saw that map where that was showing people leaving the city, and we saw the gap analysis that showed that it was mostly low income people leaving the city, and then you saw the Skansky diagram that showed those higher income people at above 100% of AMI renting units that are affordable to people 50% of AMI or below. This is kind of the start of that domino effect. And then you have to look at the typology, right? And so the city has traditionally been a lot of single family. On the for sale side, it continues to be single family, and that mix really hasn't changed. I think this is a contributing factor, right? Because without the density, you're not able to get as many units, and you're limited in the supply. So now that you kind of see kind of what's happening on the for sale market and in terms of the multifamily rental development and what the costs are and kind of what's accessible, we use that data to really validate that number around 800 million that we need to catalyze. And so we think about now, how do we get that money, right? And so what that means is, in terms of catalyzing that 800 million over the next 6 years, we think about it in three different kind of buckets. There'll likely be some private investment that comes in a number of ways. There'll likely be some philanthropic or impact-focused capital that is deployed, right? But we want to focus on what the city can do, and that's public funding and resources, right? And so within that, you've got the general fund, and you've got other resources the city may have, and then you've got new or alternative revenue sources that the city could probably create. And so I'm going to dive into that really quickly and talk about what that looks like. So we've divided this up into kind of 4 categories. The first being the other or non-monetary sources, right? So there are ways that the city can provide value to development and create affordable housing without actual cash or money. That's tax abatements, right? It's foregoing future, revenue, density bonuses, so providing, the rights to build additional housing, and the disposition of publicly owned land, right? Those are 3 non-monetary resources. And then on the short term, things that are low-hanging fruit or easy wins are, pushing money from the general fund or expanding the city's GO bond capacity, right, within the city's debt limits. Those are things that are pretty easy to do within the city's debt limits, and then also when there's money available in the general fund. What we're going to be studying over the next couple of weeks and months is looking at the medium and long-term options, right? What other funding sources or resources are possibly available for the city to work towards that $800 million? So we divided that up, as I said, into short-term options and medium-term options. In the medium term, we're looking at other things like dedicated bonds. These things often require voter approval and county government sign-on. And then you have more long-term options like new impact fees or changes to the hospitality tax or other state or federal funding that we have to advocate or lobby for, right? And so trying to think about what that looks like is important as we figure out or we help the city figure out how do you actually achieve these goals. When we look at this, we look at some of the short-term options, we started to look at what's actually possible in terms of revenue potential, right? And so, the general fund varies based on, how much money is available on an annual basis. The sale or contribution of city-owned land is, leverages existing assets, but, you forego an opportunity cost of using city-owned property for a different use, right? But I think we could get up to, $50 million of value from that. In terms of what the city's current debt capacity is, there's not much left, but you could probably get $10 million in additional GO bonds. And then in terms of TIFs, of the 6 TIFs that that we have available, there's about $20 million that we can probably pull from those. And that's just in the short-term low-hanging fruit, right? So best case scenario in the short term, you're looking at somewhere around $70 or $80 million. But those are things that I think are in the city's control and that the city can figure out. So I want to bring this back and circle it back around to kind of where we started, right? What we've done is we've helped the city really look at the problem and analyze it and from a very nuanced point of view. We've helped the city understand exactly what income levels are seeing the biggest deficits of affordable housing, what it's going to cost to create that kind of affordable housing, and where the city could possibly, get some of those funds from. And I think I want to bring it back to the current state of things is that people are moving out of the city of Charleston, right? You're losing tax base, you're losing workers, and you're gaining traffic as people move further and further out of the city and are forced to commute in. And I want to bring out this slide that I presented in September, where we talked about what happens if you do invest in housing versus what happens if you don't invest in housing, right? And I think we have to think about this as we continue to think about the resources that we're willing to make available for housing and the decisions we're making in terms of zoning and other priorities in infrastructure. And so I want to leave it here with these key takeaways, right?
Can you go back one slide really quick? Sorry, just want to
Yep.
make sure. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm gonna have all these sent out to all the council members so you can look over it again.
Okay, good.
the city and its residents must decide whether, Charleston's character, lies within, its single-family detached homes and cars, right? Or if the people that live, or it lies within the people that live and work here, right? Which one? I think you're not going to be able to have both. If you choose to, if the city continues to proliferate kind of this single-family detached model of housing, you're going to lose the people that have traditionally lived and worked here, and also lose the character of the city if you deem that to be the character of the city, right? I think there are three big things that I took away from, these studies and hearing from the city, hearing from developers throughout this process. And it's the issue's bad and it's only getting worse, right? So that means you have to act now or it's going to cost more later. The city can be in its own way. There are 17,000 units that are in the pipeline, and delays and uncertainty in the development process make housing more expensive. So the city's got to change the way of doing business and change the narrative about why it needs to, why it's imperative to create more housing. And the last thing is, it's a regional problem, right? This is not a problem that the city alone can solve, and there needs to be collaboration around the region.
But number two was the one issue I was bringing up earlier. And the mayor talked about this as well. We already have so much in the pipeline already, but we just have to get them going.
That's right. So in terms of next steps, I think before the end of the year, we want to explore, the various incentives that I talked about and what those would look like. Finalize kind of the sub-targets around eviction and the overarching stabilization goal that I mentioned at the beginning. And we want to complete the alternative revenue source and homeownership accessibility studies. This will really put the city in a good position to start thinking about what are the strategies it wants to take to reach these goals in the new year. And in the new year, we're going to continue to be here to support the city as they think about any updates to their programs and help identify best practices for them, determine any human capital needs that are going to be necessary to implement new programs, and then help the city set up the infrastructure to track against the housing goals. One of the things that slowed us down in this process was trying to bring together, aggregate all the data from various sources so that we could put this in front of you and give you a very clear picture of what the issue is. And so we want to, improve those systems so that it's not hard to pull data in the future. That's it. I'll open it up for a couple of minutes of questions. But thank you guys, and hope this was helpful and interesting.
Well, as I stated before, I would like this information to be sent out by staff, be sent out to all the council members so they can take a look at this and kind of get familiarized with it. And I know we have a lot of problems so far as housing is concerned, but we also have to look at that we're living also in a town that have a college in it, and that's a little different from some other entities that don't have it. That takes away a lot of housing also. And the price is rising because of that, because they're not paying it, but their parents are. So that kind of picks up housing prices too. From being here all these years, I can tell you the difference. And, that's going to be a problem that, we have also. And I don't think we're going to be able to really change that unless the college itself build enough housing to have those students staying in housing that's the school have itself. So that's going to be one particular thing that they could move out of the neighborhood. And also one of the biggest challenges we have is the infrastructure that's not here and the flooding. We can build all these homes we are talking about doing, but we got to have the flooding done too. We need to put the cart before the horse sometime. We got to get this flooding issue done because we can keep building and having the flood coming, and it's going to still cause a big problem also. So that's what a lot of people in the community is saying, and I'm looking at strictly community-wise also, even trying to create these the housing affordability as it sometimes used to be, not the same way it was so far as the rail is concerned, but trying to bring it down to people can be able to afford where they work, and so they can stay where they work, closer to their work, and not bringing traffic in and things like that. So it's going to be a lot of different work we have to do with this and coming into it, because so many things have been approved already, but have not started building yet. Just as Long Savannah with the 6,000 homes, that's been approved couple of years ago when I assisted approving that, but they haven't started building yet. But that's 6,000 home by itself. Any questions from the committee members? I can't see your hands.
We have
in
Councilmember McBride and then Councilmember Appel have their hands up.
All right.
Yeah, I'll just tail on to what you were saying, Chairman Mitchell, is just that in my short year so far in the council, the frustration of just the nature of how our government's divided, which has its positives, kind of a checks and balances thing, I guess, but also the negatives of, trying to address one aspect, which is affordability of housing, which helps reduce the number of homeless people and things like that, which is extremely important. But in trying to accomplish that goal, we're kind of at the mercy of the county and the state for the infrastructure. So, I know that, the city's working hard to work to help get some help in that regard. And I guess like if we were to go forward with this plan, make it official, okay, bam, we're going forward with this plan. We're going to build as much as we can, knowing our infrastructure is way, way behind. Some areas worse than others. And then, trying to get this SED, the state and the county to react to what we're doing at the city level. I'm stating the obvious here. This is something I know that people that have been on the council for forever have been dealing with for forever. So it's just kind of I'm just seeing how difficult this is, trying to solve one problem at our level, knowing we can't do other things at other levels, which are handled at the county and the state. So just to state in the obvious, I guess looking for some wise thoughts from those who've been on the council for a while to figure out how we can influence the infrastructure aspect in a positive way to match this.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, to that point, to Councilwoman Parker's point earlier about infrastructure, this is an infrastructure initiative because if you look at that map where everybody's moving out, all that does is strain the infrastructure. So by allowing people to live closer to where they work, I think you're going to see a marked difference in commutes and the like. So, and it's not just obviously traffic, it's also the flooding to the chairman's point, but we certainly need to take a holistic and collaborative approach on this. And I'm hopeful that the other municipalities and counties are wanting to do the same. And as I said, told some of you all earlier this week, I'm going to be meeting with mayors tomorrow on this, among other things on this topic. So,
Councilman Appel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the way, at least for present purposes, we deal with the infrastructure issue is we've got to work around it. I don't think we're going to do the best we can. We've got a lot of exciting initiatives and hopefully some future initiatives on the infrastructure front. But I'd be lying to you if I thought I was very bullish and optimistic about a bunch of infrastructure coming in and allowing us to support our affordable housing goals through essentially suburban sprawl, which is what's we're looking at here on this map. I always keep going back to one of my favorite statistics. During the Depression era, there were somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people in the city of Charleston, and they were all in the peninsula. And now we've got a resident population around 25,000, maybe 30,000 or so. The peninsula can support and should support tens of thousands of more people, and a lot of that can be affordable. And the way we get there is not through single family residences. That's not going to work. We're going to need to get comfortable with height. We're going to need to get comfortable with density. We're going to need to be comfortable with allowing these projects to be built without parking, because those parking requirements drive up costs and they cannibalize land. We're talking about some of those initiatives. We're all familiar with several of them based on our communications. That's the kind of stuff that's going to move the needle forward. We can't solve this problem by getting 10 units here, 13 units there, 17 units there. We need to be talking in the hundreds, and we need to be talking in the thousands. But of course, when you start talking about height and you start talking about density in the city of Charleston, you start running into things like character preservation and how is it going to look, and a lot of these other goals that we have that are important. And there's some real tension between those. So I think that really has got to be the conversation moving forward, because to the mayor's point, if we're able to put this density on the peninsula, we don't have to rely on 526 connecting Johns Island to James Island. You know, you're there, you're near the job centers, you're near, you know, all of the things that the peninsula has to offer. So, I mean, I think that's the solution. That's the way out of this. It's not going to be easy. We are oftentimes very much our own worst enemy on the regulation front. You know, we've massively over politicized housing in this country. I think that that too creates risk and barriers. And what I mean by that is all these public approvals that have to happen and things of that nature. We need to make density and affordability by right uses that don't require developers to jump through all these different hoops. Because let's also face another elephant in the room here is a lot of times affordable housing is not popular, right? NIMBYs, like that's a huge problem. Local governments, and it's not just the city of Charleston, I'm not just picking on Charleston, it's a phenomenon that's present all over the country. The system is stacked in favor of the NIMBYs because there's all these processes that exist that can be hijacked and used to delay and used to appeal and used to deny. And it's all constraints on the ability to bring these units to the market to you know, address the supply constraint, which is fundamentally the issue that we're having. So this is a wonderful presentation. I want to thank everybody who's worked on this for putting this together. You know, not every municipality in the state of South Carolina is even talking about this. The fact that we're talking about it and getting into the weeds on such a significant level is notable, and it's something that's should be applauded. And you know, the ball is in our court to act. I think we've got some opportunities in the near term that we all are familiar with, where we can really make a sizable dent into this issue. But we need to be looking more broadly at it, because at the end of the day, there's only so much government can do to subsidize and try to drive this on its own. I mean, if we can find a way to make affordable housing profitable so that the private money that's on the sidelines can really start pouring in, that's when we can really talk about getting the numbers on the peninsula to where they were almost 100 years ago. It can be done, and it can be done in a way that's you know, preserves quality of life and preserves all the things that make Charleston special. So I'll shut up now. I could go on for hours about this stuff, but enjoyed the discussion today.
We are. All right. Any other questions before we decide to adjourn? Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank you all for the presentation, and I still remind the staff that they would get this information out that we have presently to all the other council members, so they can take a look at it and be familiarized with it, because they're not hearing this, not seeing this, so they can be able to ask questions from staff, ask questions from the mayor, whomever, you know. But so we can look at this very seriously. So when it comes up next year, when the Bloomberg committee come back next year with all the information, that we can act on something. But I just want to say, so far as the peninsula is concerned, I can tell you, but the peninsula, so far as what we've been going through my whole life, and I'm like I said, I'm in the 70s, so people can talk about what the peninsula have and what they don't have, and the you know, density and all this. I know what the peninsula can do and what they can't do, and we have to get it right, because we are sinking anyway. So you will find a whole lot of things in the city of Charleston that have been built and the sinking is going down. So, you know, we have to make sure that we do something that's going to be right, and it's going to be good for the community. And this flooding, we have to look at that very seriously, because this has been going on ever since I went to school, and that's before any one of some of you all were born. So, you know, this was going on the whole time, and and still have not stopped as of today. So we have to look at these things too if we're going to start talking about higher density and doing all this housing in the peninsula, so to speak, which is needed. You know, and then I look at, and I'm a different person than most of my colleagues. I look at varied diversity. You know, we are going up the city of Charleston. People look at me are gone. They are gone. We were 60 or 70, not 70%. Now we are 14, 15% of the affordability because we cannot afford to stay here in this peninsula because of housing. My kids can't stay here and they got good jobs, but it's the affordability. So I look at things totally different from everyone else and looking at not just my kids, but everyone kids, anyone, younger person that who've been coming out of college now, they can't come in the city of Charleston and stay here and rent anything here because we do not make this type of money to be able to afford where we live, not even our staff. So it's a whole big problem with not only just the housing, but the salary, but there's a whole lot of other things that's involved in all this situation. So we're gonna have to look at this statistically of all this factor, what can cause these things to happen. Because we can build it here, but if we don't have nobody to come here, then we're still in the problem the same way. You know, so if we're gonna do it for people to be able to afford. So it's a lot of work we have to do. I'm gonna say it that way. It's a lot of work ahead of us. And we have to look at it very seriously that we are trying to do what is right for everyone. And that's everyone in the city of Charleston. I don't care who they may be. And that's the way I look at things. Because I look at things total in a big picture. And I look at a vision down the road. Because I might not be here tomorrow or the next day. But trying to put something in place that's going to happen for the future, if they may. So if we don't have any other questions or nothing else, our meeting will stand adjourned.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy holiday to everyone and be safe.